They keep digging up the same coffin, but it's empty every time. Subscribe now if you're brave enough to keep watching. It started in the small town of Warrenton, Virginia, a quiet patch of America where the wind seemed to hum through the old oak trees like a whispered warning. Nothing much ever happened there until the summer the ground refused to stay still. The first grave was opened on a Tuesday morning. Local workers were repairing the fence around St. Augustine Cemetery, an overgrown burial ground dating back to the 1800s. They were supposed to move a few old headstones for the new boundary line. But when they dug into the dirt beneath grave number 47, the coffin was gone. No wood, no bones, just an empty cavity, perfectly shaped, untouched by time. At first, everyone thought it was a clerical mistake. Old records, misnumbered plots. Things like that happened all the time. But when the crew tried again, at grave number 48, they hit something solid. A coffin. Same make, same age. Only this one wasn't supposed to be there. When they pried it open, the wood collapsed like wet paper. Inside, it was empty too. No remains, no clothing fibers, no sign that anyone had ever been laid to rest. The town sheriff, Tom Weller, was called in. He was a lifelong local, the kind of man who didn't believe in ghost stories or cursed land. But when he looked down into that dirt pit-fresh air flowing where the dead should have been, his voice caught for a second longer than he wanted to admit. By the end of the week, 6 more graves had been exhumed. Every one of them was empty, not disturbed, not robbed, just wrong. The county sent in historical surveyors from Richmond to verify the cemetery's history. One of them, Dr. Mara Keene, noticed something unsettling. Each missing burial had the same date on its headstone, October 12, 1903. No cause of death listed. No family names repeated. Just T, that same quiet date carved again and again into stone. She found records from that year-yellowed town ledgers and funeral receipts, and realized something chilling. There had been no funerals recorded that day at all, yet dozens of graves in the same section carried that date. That night, Sheriff Weller visited Mara at her motel just outside town. He brought her the oldest known photo of the cemetery, taken in 1911. In it, there was a man standing among the rows of graves. His face was pale, almost blurred by the exposure, but he was staring directly at the camera. "That's not the weird part," the sheriff muttered, pointing. "It's that coat he's wearing. That's the same uniform as our current gravedigger Jacob." Jacob was in his 70s now, born and raised in Warrenton. Worked in that cemetery for 50 years. He swore he'd never seen anything strange there, just families, funerals, and the usual silence that followed. But when Mara showed him the photograph, his hands trembled. He didn't say a word for almost a full minute. Then, softly, he whispered, "That's my father." Mara frowned. "Your father worked here too?" Jacob shook his head slowly. "No. He died before I was born." The next morning, workers returned to finish the excavation. The sheriff arrived late. Mara had been missing since dawn. Her motel room was undisturbed, car still in the parking lot, her files spread out on the table. Only one thing was gone, the old photograph of the man in the graveyard. That evening, a storm rolled in. Rain poured across the cemetery. washing soil from one of the open graves. When lightning flashed, Weller saw it something wooden glistening beneath the mud. Another coffin. He climbed down himself, flashlight trembling in his hand. The name carved into the small brass plate froze his blood. Dermara Keene, October 12, 1903, and beneath it, one line engraved in smaller letters. They always come back. The graves remember. The rain didn't stop for 3 days. It soaked the fields, flooded the roads, and turned St. Augustine Cemetery into a swamp of drowned grass and sinking memories. Sheriff Tom Weller barely slept. The brass nameplate he'd found, Dermara Keene, October 12, 1903, sat on his desk like a dare. He'd sent it to the county lab for testing, hoping for an explanation grounded in something sane. But the results made no sense. The metal was over a century old. And worse, the engraving wasn't done with modern tools. It had been etched by hand, the style matching those used in the early 1900s. The coffin itself, now sealed in evidence storage, was empty, just like the others. Weller tried calling Mara's colleagues in Richmond. No one had heard from her. Her emails stopped the night she disappeared. Her phone pinged once near the cemetery gates, and then never again. That night, he returned to the motel to search her room one more time. The air inside felt wrong, thick, like the moment before lightning strikes. He noticed her notes spread across the table, half soaked by a leaking window. One line caught his eye. October 12, 1903. The Warrenton burials. Not a plague, not a fire, but a ceiling. A ceiling? He frowned. Beneath it, Mara had scribbled something else in haste, barely legible under the ink smears. The dead were buried empty. The souls never left. He heard a knock then. 3 soft, deliberate taps at the door. Weller's hand went to his holster. "Who's there?" No reply. Just another knock, slower this time. He opened the door to nothing but rain. But when he looked down, there were muddy footprints leading from the hallway, bare, too small to be a man's. They ended right at his threshold. He slammed the door shut. The sheriff didn't go home that night. He sat at the table, rereading Mara's notes until dawn. When the storm finally broke, he went back to the cemetery. Jacob, the old gravedigger, was already there, standing near the open graves, his boots sunk deep into the muck. He looked pale, his eyes hollow like he hadn't slept in years. "They're moving again," he said quietly. Weller stared at him. "What do you mean, moving?" Jacob pointed to the far row, the one where the earth looked freshly disturbed. "I covered that one yesterday. It's open again." They approached it slowly. The headstone was old, cracked down the middle. The name was almost unreadable, but Weller could make out the faint letters. "Eleanor Keene. Keene," he whispered. "Mara's family?" Jacob nodded. "Her great-grandmother, I think. Town records said she was buried alive. Back then, they called it sleep paralysis. Said she woke too late, trapped in her coffin." He looked down, voice trembling. People started hearing screams under the dirt. The sheriff felt the ground shiver beneath his boots. Faint, but real. He knelt, brushing mud from the edges of the coffin lid. For a second, he could swear he heard it, a weak sound, like breathing through wood. He froze. Jacob," he whispered. "Do you hear that?" But Jacob was gone. Only his shovel lay in the mud, still warm to the touch. A figure stood by the oak tree at the edge of the cemetery, silhouetted in the gray morning mist. A woman's figure, her hair long, soaked from the rain. Her head tilted slightly, as if listening. "Mara?" Weller's voice cracked. The figure didn't move. He took a cautious step forward, and then another. She turned her face just enough for him to see. It wasn't Mara. The eyes were too dark, the mouth too still. She smiled faintly, then whispered something Weller could barely hear. A rasp carried on the wind. "They're all waiting to be found." And then she vanished into the fog. Weller stumbled back, breath shallow. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A new message. No number, no signal. Just one line of text. "Stop digging." The sheriff dropped the phone. Behind him, the earth shifted again. Another grave cracking open with a wet sigh, as if the ground itself were exhaling after a long sleep. And this time there was something inside not empty, not decayed, but freshly filled. When Weller brushed away the mud, his flashlight trembled over the brass plate. Sheriff Thomas Weller, October 12, 1903. He stepped back in horror, heart hammering, as the dirt began to cave inward, swallowing the name. The ground didn't want to let him leave. The day that never ended. By the time the sun rose over Warrenton, Sheriff Weller was no longer sure what was real. The cemetery was silent now. No movement, no rain, no Jacob. Just an unnatural calm, as if the world itself had taken a breath and refused to exhale. He backed away from the grave bearing his own name, mud clinging to his boots. His hands shook so violently he could barely hold his flashlight. How could a plate that old have his name on it? The thought pressed against his skull until it felt like his mind would split. The wind rustled through the trees, dry this time. No storm, no birds, only the faint creak of branches like whispering voices. Weller forced himself to keep walking. He needed to reach his car, get to town, tell someone, anyone. But the cemetery gate was gone. Where it should have been stood a solid wall of trees, gnarled and ancient, roots twisted like limbs. He turned in every direction. The roads, the fence, the tools gone. Even the church steeple that had always loomed nearby had vanished into fog. He was still in the same place, but the world had folded differently around it. Something moved behind him, the faint scrape of wood on stone. He turned his light toward the graves. The open coffins had shifted. They now stood upright, half buried like doorways waiting to be opened, and each one had a name he recognized. Jacob, Mara, Eleanor. His own name shone faintly on the fourth. He stumbled back, heart hammering. "What do you want from me?" he yelled. Of Sheriff Thomas Weller and Dr. Mara Keene. The report mentioned flooding damage at St. Augustine Cemetery. No bodies were ever recovered. But on October 12th every year, townsfolk say they hear the ground move, sometimes softly, sometimes enough to shake the fence posts. And once, a local boy swore he saw a man in a sheriff's coat standing among the graves at dawn, staring at a headstone that read his own name. When he looked again, the man was gone. If this story haunted you, the next one will keep you awake. Hit subscribe if you dare.